The mice have their uses, obviously. Not in a domestic setting, I hope, with most of us. So, yesterday we concentrated on how we do it, and today you can see why we can do it. You can see that. That was the overall carte du jour, and what's on the table this morning is this. Why we can do it is because we're going to be looking at the evolution of man corresponding with the evolution of mind. And then we can ask, where does genius arise? How does it arise? And then some of the maladies of genius. So it's well known that genius and madness go together. So if you're going mad, that's a very good sign. Then after looking at the maladies of genius, we have to ask ourselves, and this is hardly going to be an exposition on artificial intelligence and psychedelics and all the rest of it, but as I said yesterday, the Theosophical Society is not to bury its head in the sand. We have to address these issues intelligently. Certainly, we don't have to go along with them, but we have to be aware of what's happening in the world, where artificial intelligence and psychedelics, for some people, are the bee's knees, and they may not be our way of setting about things, but let's understand it. And then talk about higher dimensions. We seem to be obsessed with the idea that we live in just a physical world with three dimensions of space and time. Well, of course, that's not so. And finally, summing up with some closing reflections of my own. So will this work? Yes, it always does.
It has a answer.
Yeah. So let's remind ourselves of the injunction of the great Japanese sage that you must always follow your own path. You can be inspired by the great masters, but if you try and follow their path, well, for a start, you won't succeed. But even if you do make the attempt, then it's hardly a creative process. You're just being a photocopying parrot, to mix a few metaphors there. So seek what they sought. So do not follow in the footsteps of the masters. So that's the first and only commandment. Be inspired, but don't imitate. Okay, yeah, sure. Be inspired.
But what's the mic?
No, not at all. No, I'll be the mic. Be inspired, but don't imitate. And the question then is, how do we attain inspiration in our own chosen field? And does it help to have a good brain? Is my next question. Would you like a good brain? You dare not say no. Well, here are some pictures of Einstein's brain preserved in formaldehyde in Princeton University, and presumably they know tariffs on the preservation of brains yet to come in America, God forbid. So, but the whole point is that Sandra Whittleson has written a paper in the not Nature, in what's the Lancet, yeah, that a person's mathematical ability is correlated with the width of the brain. And Einstein's brain was, well, 15% wider than most people, hence his brainy genius. And a person's thinking capacity is explained by changes in the brain structure. But there's always a fly in the ointment. John Lorber was a professor of neurology at Sheffield University in England, and he identified several students, mathematics students as well, with no detectable brain. And this is an academic, clinical finding. It's not just what's popularly known as conspiracy theory. So John Lorber, he identified university mathematics students with no detectable brain, and even with an IQ of 120. So what's that telling us? There are mysteries, and we can't be too dogmatic about anything. So let's look at the whole spectrum of man. But I mean, it's for a human being. I mean, it's understand this word could be that means to think about the minds. And if we liken the whole human being to a power station, we have obviously the main generating station, the transmitting wires, the transformers, and the consumer. And obviously, if all the power in the electricity station were to flood this light bulb there, it would explode. So we need transformers to step down the power. I'm using rather non-electrical terms and current and voltage and all of that. So that's pretty obvious. But what happens on our physical level is really a reflection of what happens on higher levels. So we human beings also have transformers, and then those transformers are known as the soul, generic term soul. We have the spiritual soul, the human soul, and the animal soul to transform the atma, the current of the divine consciousness, down to a level that the body can handle. So there's divine consciousness, which projects an aspect of itself into the physical body with the help of the spiritual soul, the human soul, and the animal soul, which can be likened to these three transformers. Make sense? So people ask, how do you define soul, and is soul the same as spirit? And so I'm suggesting soul is that interface between the divine source and the physical body at various levels to step down the power of the divine source into the level at which the human body can handle. And for that reason, we always look at man in terms of the spirit, soul, and body. The spirit associated, of course, with the sun, soul, the lunar, and body, the terrestrial. And my favorite image for that is really the sun, and how the light of the sun is diminished by the clouds and reflected in the water, the emotional nature. Bearing in mind always that the great sages have always put their finger on the truth in just a few words. And Plutarch said, the earth has given the body, has given us the body, the moon has given us the soul, and the sun, the understanding to the generation of man note the word understanding, to the generation, the production, the generation of man. So that's one way of looking at our human constitution, and there are many other maps. These are only maps. How does science, biological science, look at the human being? Let's not labor the point. It is very, very much a question of, we start with lifeless matter. This is mainstream science, which is very much still in the core. Of course, there are enlightened scientists, many of them like Rupert Sheldrake, like Amit Goswami, that in the mainstream, if I tell you that the Templeton Foundation, a couple of years ago at the conference in Illinois, are putting forward a prize of $25 million to find out by two clever experiments how the brain generates consciousness. That immediately tells us that intelligence, consciousness, is the product, the interaction of physical matter. So for science, man has evolved from elementary particles that and the interactions of them produce amino acids and then proteins, and the whole process is going from bottom upwards. And the latest example is they discovered amino acids in one of the satellites in the solar system. The theory is known as panspermia, in other words, seeding our planet with molecules from galactic space. And as a result of that interaction, there were more complex molecules, and that resulted in the production of intelligence. So what you see there is a timeline, so to speak. It's a little bit out of date, but who cares, because it's wrong. Sorry to put it so bluntly. It's not wrong in terms of the physical discoveries, don't get me wrong. It's wrong in terms of the interpretation. It's not wrong to say that 400 billion years ago, there were land plants and animals. That's the physical discovery, but the interpretation is what I'm getting at. Okay, so that's what mainstream science tells us now. But we now really have to part company with these four canons of mainstream science, which is that Darwinism is the sole explanatory theory, as realized by Darwin's own wonderful colleague, Wallace, Alfred Russel Wallace. We have to get the idea that the brain produces consciousness, and human life exists only on Earth, apart from, as I said, microbacteria in other planets in space, and that life expresses only through the physical body. And this was realized all those years ago by none other than Wallace, who was Darwin's co-author in a paper before Darwin wrote his groundbreaking Origin of Species. So it was Wallace himself who realized that natural selection could not account for such things as mathematical genius.
Because the gigantic development of a mathematical faculty is totally unexplained by natural selection, which is a very gradual process of some flowering
of mathematical or any other genius. You can't just put it down to a theory of natural selection. So on that basis, the occult, theosophical, if you like, doctrine on evolution could be summarized in terms of four core principles. which are really quite simple. Things look complicated when you put them out in linear fashion on a slide, but one follows from the other, and that everything in the physical universe is really the outcome of metaphysical principles, and they are septenary. And then evolution proceeds on many levels. And this brings in the whole subject of rounds and races, which is a cliched term now almost. It's one of the most beautiful and wonderful doctrines, in my opinion, of occult science. And if you had to ask me what was the one central, the most beautiful doctrine that Theosophy, Blavatsky, has given us, it is this doctrine of rounds and races. And I'm very sorry to say that, in my opinion, our theosophical scientists have not done it justice, because they have always approached the subject of rounds and races from the scientific point of view, and you cannot do that. It's just nonsensical to try and relate something that is so on a different dimension and try and bring it down to the physical dimension and say astronomy has not discovered it. No, it hasn't. It never will. But the beauty, the consistency, the logic, all of that in this tremendously complicated but yet simple in principle doctrine of rounds and races, in my opinion, is the one key that will unlock the mystery of consciousness and life to science. Except that I think the time is far too premature to even attempt that with most of our scientific friends. We have to proceed gradually. But in any case, it is ridiculous to say that there's only life on this planet Earth apart from bacteria in space. And just as the human being progresses through various stages from infancy to adulthood, and then a human being is promoted. You know what I mean by promoted? In the scientific medical network, when a person dies, we say he has been promoted. Well, it is a promotion. It should be a decent sort of chap. So anyway, and then our present round is the fourth, and the majority of our humanity pertain to the fifth race. So I will very quickly, very cursory fashion, go through this process of the development of the mind and start by pointing out that humanity really represents the joint activity of the lunar Pitris, the lunar fathers, who gave man the form, and the solar Pitris, who endowed the form with mind and intellect. And wherever we look, any activity has to be the joint endeavor of an animating impulse and its medium of expression. A pianist needs a piano. The composer needs the pianist. At all levels, we have to have the form and the animating principle that animates the form. So starting every country, every race in the world has given hundreds, and I mean literally hundreds, you can look it up, of names to all the solar and lunar deities. And for materialists to say this is all exploded superstition is just the most arrogant nonsense. You can't have hundreds of thousands of people in different nations all sharing the same superstition unless there is a telepathy of superstition, which science can't explain. So starting then with the first root race, this is little, I mean, it's not complicated. it just looks it as a table, but just look at the yellow highlight. The mind, the first race, which we're told was the essentially the lunar Petries, it was mindless. But what does mindless mean? When you, all of us, were born on day one, we were mindless. It doesn't mean we didn't have mind. It meant our mind had not been awakened. And how is mind awakened? By the overshadowing of the parental influence and then going to school. So in just the same way as our mind as human beings now, when we were born, in just the same way as our mind was awakened, similarly, the mind of the human race was awakened. So you can see the beautiful logic and consistency going through the whole teaching. So the first race was obviously mindless. And then there was this movement into increasing materiality, because you have to evolve the material principle for the mind to operate through. So the second race, as you can see, was still mindless, but developing the seeds of mind, which happened in this most momentous period, absolutely vast period, of course, during the third root race, when it was realized that nature unaided fails, which is the famous saying, and the mindless state of the then human being was awakened by the overshadowing of the Manasaputras, these solar Petries, the solar angels, from a higher realm of consciousness who had been through the human state and were able to to activate the human mind. And it's very important to appreciate that they did not give mind, they activated the mind in the same way as a parent doesn't give its child mind. It is born with mind, but the parent activates mind by overshadowing the infant with, well, thoughts of obedience and love and compassion and all these things that parents should teach children before they get on their iPhones and all that rubbish. So, of course, this was a massive period of time, and science has not exactly disproved that. But here you can see some examples of statues on East Island that are supposed to date to the Lemurian third root race period. And here is a map. During the third root race period, there was the separation of the sexes, asexual, hermaphrodite, and then the separation. And in my own mind, I've never quite worked out, and I really welcome your feedback on this. I've never worked out whether the activity of the Manasaputras was before the separation of the sexes or after or during that period. Of course, we're talking of vast epochs of time, so one can't be cut and dried about this. But was it when this before the race had separated, or was it after the race had separated? Except that when the second activity of the Manasaputras occurred during the early fourth root race, the Atlantean period, there was definitely the separation. So this is a complex period. So the fourth race was the age of deepest immersion in materiality, of course, and then the mind principle had been awakened, and some rather unfortunate circumstances issued, which we won't touch about. But what I'm really trying to do is just show this timeline of how we've always had mind, but how our mind has been awakened from latency into activity till we now come to the fifth root race, which is the turning point. So having been, having gone through increasing materiality, we now are evolving out of that to increasing spirituality. And then we're told about the sixth and the seventh root races, which we all look forward to in many incarnations to come. And presumably the European School of Theosophy will also be meeting on a different continent during the sixth and seventh root races.
No, we can go to other continents now. We don't get to wait.
Okay, yeah. Well,
I think I had to go to South Africa, for example.
yeah, no, yes, well remembered, very well remembered. Yes, well, that note of optimism is a mark of an intrepid theosophist. Yeah. So now the point of all of this, to show that the mind principle was awakened, is really this: where does genius come from? Genius, whence, how, and whither. So what is the human mind in its higher aspect? One of Blavatsky's immortal sayings: if it is not a portion of the essence, and sometimes the very essence, of the incarnation of a higher being from a higher and divine plane. So, as the teaching goes, some dhyanis, some of the solar pitris, master sutras, projected a spark, and some entered the chayas, the shadow, the shadow form, the early human form. Some entered the human form. And the grade of mind, I would suggest, the grade of mind that all human beings display is really a function of the amount of essence projected by the Mantraputras into the Chayas. I mean, if that's not logical, just shout and, have me for supper. Because what I'm then suggesting is that the portion of essence is the average intelligence. The majority of the essence projected is genius, and the very essence resulted in the rishis, the adepts, and the sages. But there's always a but to this, which is pretty obvious. The grade of mind is karmically conditioned because the incarnating powers and principles had to make a choice between and take into account the past karmas of the monads, in the same way as you have a beautiful baby born to you, and you can only teach it what it can learn. You can't teach it what it doesn't want to learn, and I think every parent discovers this to their cost sometimes. And also you can't make a child do what it's not meant to do. If you want to, you may want your child to be a doctor, but if the child wants to be a footballer, well, bad luck, he won't. So therefore, the reasons for the wide difference among human beings, their minds and characteristics, is simply this: that if you look at the top row, if you just look at the top row, they are the three types of human beings and the mind quality displayed by them. And you're going to get all of these slides. I know it's a little bit complicated, but it's really making the point that depending on the amount of essence projected by the Manasaputras into the early human race, it will determine the kind of human being you're going to be. And finally, what's known as the laggards are the lesser classes, and that's not meant to sound patronizing or pejorative. And every life form goes through stages. And the laggards will occupy the animal form at the mid-fourth race and will become human at the next planetary Manvatara, the next cycle of the planet. So the three classes, and this is the next slide, is possibly the most important. The three classes of Dhyanis, but don't regard the three classes as three separate entities. It's one host displaying three different functions. In the same way as a parent, it can be a teacher, a disciplinarian, and also anything else. So the three classes, the same being the three groups or aspects, the Kumaras represent the original purity. The Agnishvatras are sweetened by the fire, and I'll explain that, and the Manasaputras. The first, the Kumaras, are, as I said, signify the original purity, and the Manasaputras on the right-hand side, the green arrow, represent the higher mind. And man's higher self, in terms of its spiritual parts, the Atma Buddhi, the Buddhi Manas, and the Manas, can broadly be correlated with the activity of the Kumaras, the Agnishvatas, and the Manasaputras. So the first, the Kumaras, it represents innate genius. You're born with genius, so to speak. The second is realized genius when you've worked on it and realized it. And the third one is expressed genius. So the first is, in terms of my next example, is innate musicality. The second is you can be very musical to start with, but you've got to work on it. So you've got to be sweetened by the fire of many hours of suffering and hard work and practice to become, say, a virtuoso violinist. And then you can be a violin teacher. But in terms of what I put up earlier, that the incarnating powers had to choose according to the karmic condition of the chayas. If you are a violin teacher and you're the greatest violin teacher and you have a pupil, you can only teach it what you can. If that child is really unmusical, the greatest teacher can do very little and just entertain it and say, go home and do something else. If that child has been sent to a violin teacher because mummy and daddy said it's very good for little girls to play the violin to get a nice husband afterwards, again, I can't do anything with you. But if that child is yearning to learn, then I can infuse my learning into you. That's obvious. So I can only give you what you can take. But also, the point I'm being made here is that innate musicality can never touch or harness its potential unless it touches a physical violin. Otherwise, it's just abstract. You can be highly innately musical, but it has to engage with the physical principle in order to express its genius. Similarly, the Manasaputras were the activity of that was that communication of higher mind. The Agnishvatas really were to do with that sweetening, I've called it sweetened by the spiritual fire. So you can relate all of these lofty doctrines to our life now. Just look at a teacher, look at a parent, look at an educator in any field, and you can see how these principles work on various and different levels. So now with genius, you choose. How nice to have a choice. What is human mind, as Blavatsky said, if it is not a portion of the essence, and sometimes the very essence of the or incarnation of the higher being from a higher and divine plane? You can choose that, or you can choose this one, which I promise you still pervades most of mainstream science. And this is Francis Crick. You, your joys, your suffering, and all of that, and I would add your genius, and presumably your mathematical genius, are nothing more and no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And this really shows how even Nobel laureates are so philosophically primitive, because they confuse the vehicle of expression with that which animates that vehicle. You might as well confuse the car with the driver, even though you need both to make a journey. And Crick has the audacity to say that when, I think in early in the 1930s, the great neurologist Sir Francis Walsh said how childish it was to conflate the organ of intelligence, the brain, with the mind. So Nobel laureates are certainly not in agreement. This is on the left-hand side. This is what Crick has said. And Gerald Edelman, another Nobel laureate, has pointed out how silly it is to reduce human behavior to a theory of molecular interactions. But still, as I will say for the last time, the molecular theory still dominates mainstream science in no uncertain terms. Otherwise, Templeton wouldn't offer 25 million to find out how the brain generates consciousness. You know, it's really tantamount to saying it's a molecular theory. So now we're going to go mad and find out. All right, can I go back? Oh yeah, here we are. Oh yeah, you're going to go mad now. Yeah, doesn't it feel like that when you go mad? Well, the whole idea of pointing this out is that because of the intensity of the inner being, if the physical vehicle can't handle that intensity, there are going to be problems. So if you have a Ferrari engine in the chassis of a Morris Minor or Mini, it's going to shatter the structure because the engine's too powerful for the vehicle it's contained in. So for similar reasons, a lot of geniuses have had so many problems, including mental problems, and that is why, in my opinion, that's the whole point of Hatha Yoga. It's obviously not a beauty therapy like some people like to say. It's purely so that the physical foundation can withstand the pressure, the internal pressure of the activity of the higher self. So it is very important to concentrate on the physical body, and it is quite silly to say the body is unimportant. All of these things are relative. The body is highly important because you can be as uh, compassionate and spiritual and philanthropic as you like, but if you can't do something and go around and be active, then and your body lets you down, then that's it's a bit of a shame. So the body is important, but it's important for this reason and not for the sake of being the body. And that's the point I want to make. So don't go mad. Take it easy. Now, what about artificial intelligence? Of course, one can say a lot about these things, and this isn't going to be a talk on artificial intelligence, but the basic elements of artificial intelligence is the capability of computational systems to perform this. The literature says perform, I would say mimic tasks typically associated with the human being. And the mechanical heart of artificial intelligence is the large language module, which is really an algorithm-based machine, which is being trained on vast amounts of data. And there is an iterative route that the training results in a better refinement of the algorithms. And then the GPT, the generative pre-trained transformers that are used to generate text based on the semantic rules. And finally, the chat box, better known in my opinion as the chatterbox, which is what it is, which is really a general AI system to simulate the way a human would behave if he had a conversational partner. But again, with all of this, the underlying assumptions are the important things. We tend to concentrate too much on what people say, but not what they base it on and what their presuppositions are and what their assumptions are. So, of course, the underlying assumptions is that mind is to brain as software is to computers, and therefore a mind is essentially the software of the brain. Mind is the software of the brain, and physical matter is all there is, and intelligence, whether in the computer or in the brain, is the product of or generated by the interactions of matter. So those are the underlying assumptions. And now with AI, they can do some rather clever things. Which one is the real Mona Lisa? It's not difficult. Hmm? Yeah. Oh, what do you mean second? Which is other? On the left or the right? Obviously. Yeah. Yeah. But there is an important point I want to make. In terms of creativity, which is what we all hear about, artificial intelligence singularly fails in that it can only produce more of the same. What the real genius shows is that quantum leap. It's not more of the same. It's not an extrapolation of the same. So in terms of, as an engineering example, here is the internal combustion engine. Great use of when we drive our cars. But the great Sir Frank Whittle, when he invented the jet engine, which is this, this bears no relation to the internal combustion. Of course, it uses fuel and air and steel, but the principle of the jet engine is completely different. So this was a quantum leap in creativity. And I would suggest no AI could make that shift from, in any field, from the internal combustion to the jet engine. It was a leap of consciousness. And we all are very grateful to the jet engine when we fly home, aren't we? You can't fly home with an internal combustion engine on a piston engine aircraft, as we used to do many years ago. So I would leave AI alone at the moment, but use it use it judiciously. It's there to be used and it's there to be abused. So it's up to us not to be swept into the euphoria of AI. So I'd suggest that artificial intelligence is machinery on chemical psychedelics, if I can put it that way. And what happens with psychedelics now? Well, there's now this psychedelic renaissance, as they like to call it. The two psychedelics do two things. There is divergent thinking, which is the generation of useful ideas, often in a free-flowing form. And there is convergent thinking, which is really the evolution of existing ideas converging to a object or a set conclusion. And if psychedelics have any use at all, of course, the field of application is divergent thinking, where you're free flowing and you're out of the box, so to speak. I'm very well aware that Aldous Huxley took mescaline, and as a result, he realized that the boundaries between self and not self were dissolving, and he wrote that famous book, The Doors of Perception. But not all of us are Aldous Huxley, and I would say that the huge danger of psychedelics is that if you try to take the kingdom of heaven by storm, you will pay a very heavy price. And in no field of human endeavor do we ever achieve something for nothing. You know, if it takes years and years to perfect a sports technique or a musical technique, to think that you can achieve the ultimate goal of the human race, enlightenment, by taking a drug, to mine is absolute palpable nonsense. I'm not saying that it doesn't expand your consciousness. I'm not saying it doesn't expand your field of awareness, but that is not to be confused with enlightenment. There's a big difference. So far more meaningful is study of higher dimensions. And this was the work done by Bernard Carr. At the moment, we go from one dimension, of course, to M theory, 13 dimensions, where mind and space are seen to be one entity, really. Mind is space, space and mind come together. So to summarize, which we must do now, here is the creative process where we don't follow others, but we follow our own, we chart our own territory inspired by others. The cause of genius is the seed. The conditions we need are external quiet and internal quiet. And the characteristics we find among creative people is the ability to work under great pressure, to be detached from worldly conditions, and supreme confidence, and also humility. So one of my favorite HBB quotes is that the physical man is the musical instrument and the higher self, the performing artist. And as I said earlier, you can give Paganini a rubbish, cheap, cracked fiddle, and he really couldn't produce beautiful sounds. He needs a Stradivarius. So the physical body may be likened, therefore, to this precious instrument, or maybe a cheap and cracked fiddle, but it's always in the hands of the immortal artist who plays on that instrument. So here we see the projection from the performing artist to the instrument, which is the same really as the projection from the spiritual soul to the brain and body. What?
She was utterly well.
Oh.
I just said that I would like to make a question.
Yeah.
That's why I raised my hand.
Yeah, but I'm aware of the time.
No.
Oh, right.
Suppose
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
that
Yeah, I know. Never mind. Yeah.
your consciousness is too open.
All right. Right. Yes.
Cool.
Yeah, I will do. Yeah. Well, here you see, just as Paganini needs a Stradivarius and not a cheap and cracked fiddle, so as the performing artist, so the spiritual soul needs the beautiful brain and body, hence the importance of the brain and body. And I sincerely believe this beautiful quote from Light on the Path, that the soul of man is immortal and its future is really the future for thing whose growth and splendor has no limits, but we are in charge of that growth and splendor. So now really just a few afterthoughts. The great Mozart, his personal circumstances, not in the last year, but in the last 11 months of his 35-year-old life, he had all of that to cope with. And believe you me, Mozart is highly researched. This isn't just conjecture. He's one of the most researched, and Beethoven, of course. And in 11 months, this was his output, including the magic flute, the clarinet quintet, most of the requiem, the 27 piano concerto. And if you think he was in good health, well, just read this. This is what he had to cope with. And that's what I mean by when the internal pressure is so tremendous, the physical body can only handle so much. So finally, by way of afterthoughts and reflections, here we see this miracle of nature, where he actually said, it is a mistake to think that the practice of my art has become easy. Even he would admit that it required work. So recognizing genius is one thing, and appreciating genius is another thing. Now, Caroline Pichler was an Austrian historical novelist whose salon was frequented by Beethoven and Schubert. And as a young girl, Caroline had lessons with Mozart, and she knew Haydn and Mozart. She knew Haydn and Mozart. And in her memoirs, recalling that she knew Haydn and Mozart, she wrote, there were men in whose personal intercourse there was absolutely no sign of unusual powers of intellect, and almost no trace of intellectual culture or any other scholarly or high interest. A rather ordinary turn of mind, silly jokes, and in the case of Mozart, an irresponsible way of life was all that characterized them. Now, that's why I say we have to recognize genius. You can have a genius before you. If you don't recognize, you won't. By contrast, Haydn, the great Joseph Haydn, said, He personally told Mozart's father, Leopold, before God, and as an honest man, I tell you that your son is the greatest composer known to me in person or by name. He has taste and furthermore the most profound knowledge of composition. So Mozart's sister Nano put her finger on the pulse of his genius when she said, Mozart remained a child all his life. All the practicalities of life, which occupy so many adults, had no meaning for him. He was truly alive only when he was creating music in the solitude of his room. So his real existence remained hidden. And as the opera librettist Da Ponte put it remained hidden like a precious stone buried in the bowels of the earth. And so, like so many geniuses, way ahead of their time, only after Mozart was buried did the world slowly realize what an abundance of life he had given to us. Thank you.
Yes.